Good evening. Welcome everyone in person and online to Guns in America, an expert debate on gun control. My name is Jessica Chiriboga, and I'm a 24, and I am the President Emeritus of the Dartmouth Political Union. On behalf of the DPU, we want to thank you for joining us for tonight's conversation. You may have noticed the QR code on the projection. That is a poll that we are conducting at the outset of the debate to see where the audience stands on 2 debate questions. If you haven't yet, please take a second to vote on this poll, and we will see where the audience stands both at the beginning of the event and at the end of the event. The DPU is a preeminent, nonpartisan, student-led organization dedicated to promoting open discourse on campus. To that end, the DPU hosts speakers from across the political spectrum, holds both student and expert debates, and organizes campus-wide discussions on relevant political issues. The DPU believes that advancing the robust exchange of ideas is the responsibility of institutions of higher education in a free and open democratic society. At Dartmouth, students have historically led this charge. In the late 18th century, literary societies were founded by students and functioned as nonpartisan forums for dialogue on public affairs. Today, we at the DPU root our mission in this history and continue this tradition of furthering dialogue on issues of societal importance. I would now like to introduce the moderator for tonight's debate, DPU Ambassador Grayling Peterson. Grayling is a member A very well-deserved round of applause for Grayling there. Grayling is a member of the class of 2024 studying engineering. I would also like to welcome our incredible debaters, Spike Cohen and David Hogg. Spike Cohen was a Libertarian candidate for vice president in 2020. Traveling across the country and speaking with victims of the war on guns, he has seen firsthand the harms caused by gun control and the dire need to end it. He is the founder of You Are the Power, a nonprofit dedicated to helping people who are being victimized by their local governments. Round of applause for Spike Cohen there. And we are also joined tonight in our debate by David Hogg. David Hogg, a survivor of the Parkland school shooting, has become a prominent voice of his generation advocating against gun violence. Co-founding March for Our Lives, he led one of the nation's largest demonstrations, rallying 800,000 protesters in Washington, D.C. A Harvard graduate, David co-founded Leaders We Deserve, aiming to elect young progressives. Thank you both for joining us again. As always, any views expressed by our speakers are not endorsed by the Dartmouth Political Union. Tonight's debate will begin with a moderated discussion, followed by an audience question and answer period, and will also conclude with a post-debate survey. If you'd like to ask a question, 2 DPU ambassadors will be holding microphones in the aisles for you. We ask that attendees ask questions and let the DPU ambassadors hold the microphone for them. And finally, let's consult the results of our pre-debate survey to see where the audience stands. So with around 174 responses, for the first question, we asked, does gun ownership increase or decrease safety? 74% believe that gun ownership increases safety, and 28% believe that it decreases safety. For the second question, do you favor stricter gun laws? 71.8% believe that do not favor stricter gun laws, and 28.2% favor stricter gun laws. All right, well, those are our results of the pre-debate survey, and thank you all once again, and I'm going to turn it over to Grayling for the debate.
Thank you, Jess. We will begin with opening statements, 3 minutes from each of our debaters. David, would you like to start?
Sure. I don't know if I even need 3 minutes to talk. I think most of you know where I stand on this. I would like to address one thing in general, though, which is that my view of addressing gun violence is not solely about addressing how somebody gets a gun. That is part of it, but it's only that. It is only part of it. I believe that we also need to address why somebody feels the need to kill somebody else, which I think most of us in this room actually agree on, including those who took the poll. part of why I say that is because I'll acknowledge that no law is perfect by any means, but there still is the need to have them in a society with order. And that applies to guns as well. No right is unlimited. There's a reason why you can't scream fire in a crowded theater in the first place. But that also means that we have to address, as I said, why somebody picks up a gun. In my case in Parkland, that looks like addressing the fact that the shooter at my high school had repeatedly, he was a 19-year-old, that had repeatedly, I'm just checking the time, that had repeatedly threatened to shoot up my high school. He was reported to local law enforcement, he was reported to the FBI, and had had the police called on him over a dozen times before the shooting. Despite all of that, he was still able to legally obtain an AR-15. And as a result, he shot 34 of my classmates and killed 17 of my classmates and teachers. And personally, I've grown up around guns my entire life. My dad was an FBI agent. My first time shooting guns was when I was in 4th grade. This may be news to some of you, but I was even in the shooting club at my college. I understand the power behind these weapons, but I also understand that there's responsibility that comes with that in the first place. And I don't see why there is any need why somebody who repeatedly threatens to shoot up a high school should be able to legally continue to own or even have an AR-15 in the first place. I don't believe that's an affront to anybody's civil liberties. I believe it's actually protection of all of ours to our right, to things like domestic tranquility, as are also talked about. And I think there's just a lot of nuance that has to be had in this conversation. I don't want this to be a screaming match between Spike and I know that he doesn't want that either. As entertaining as that might be for the 12 watch parties that you've set up, apparently. But I really think that this is supposed to be a conversation. That's what I want to focus on. I respect Spike as a person, even if I have disagreements with him. And I think the only way that we're going to make progress on this issue is addressing, the parts where we don't agree, which we hear all the time, and it's very entertaining. But the thing that I'm most interested in is making progress here and figuring out what we can agree on so that we can move forward as a country, make ourselves safer, and actually do whatever we can in the interim period while we continue having these debates to focus on what we can agree on to make progress. Not because it benefits one party or the other or anything like that, but because it benefits the future of this country and ensuring that nothing like Parkland ever happens again. That's why I'm here today. It's not to get in a screaming match. It's not to spew a bunch of talking points or anything like that. I didn't even bring a piece of paper with me because I wanted to just have a conversation.
Thank you. Spike.
Yeah,
your
absolutely.
opening statement.
I agree, no screaming allowed. And to be fair, I actually didn't set up the watch parties, David. We just found out there were watch parties, so we let people know about them. So no, I agree with David. I think there actually are going to be some things that David and I agree upon on how we can deal with violence in this country. I think we're not going to agree when it comes to trying to centrally plan who can and can't have firearms. I think that's where the disagreement's going to happen. I'm happy to be here in Hanover, New Hampshire. And as you may or may not know, we are right now in one of the places, Grafton County, New Hampshire, and New Hampshire as a state, where it is one of the easiest places, actually the easiest place in the country to get a firearm. It has the least firearms restrictions of any state in the union. It also happens to have the lowest homicide rate. And it's not alone. The other states that also have permitless carry and some of the loosest restrictions on firearms ownership are the neighboring states of Vermont and Maine. Those are the 3 lowest homicide rates in the country. Their rates are actually comparable to Europe. And speaking of Europe, the country that has easily the loosest firearms restrictions in Europe is the Czech Republic, and they have the lowest firearms or the lowest homicide rate in the country. And so to put a finer point on this, there are going to be things that David and I agree on. I think where we disagree is that firearms are not the problem. Firearms are not what cause violence. We have, each one of you was born, check the time, each one of you was born from the very moment of the beginning of your existence, you have rights that are not supposed to be infringed upon by anyone. We call them natural rights. 2 of those rights are the right to defend yourself and others, and the right to own justly acquired property. You're allowed to buy things and own them. You're allowed to make things and own them. You're allowed to have people give you things and own them. And so what that amounts to is that you have a pre-existing natural right to keep and bear arms for the defense of yourself and others. We are one of the few countries, I believe the only country, that actually affirms this pre-existing natural right and forbids any government at any level from infringing upon it. The last thing I want to end with, and I may run out of time on this and I can expand upon it, is I hope in our discussion, instead of broadly just talking about gun violence, we break those down into what they mean. Because if you just say gun violence, what you're doing is you're lumping in the nearly 2/3 of the people that are included in gun violence who are people who killed themselves. And every single, and I know you've talked about this as well, every single study that shows what the top reasons are for committing suicide, whether it's depression, whether it's substance abuse, psychosis, a cry for help where they didn't actually intend to kill themselves, but unfortunately they did. All of them were doing this because they felt like there was no hope. And as someone who has battled in the past with depression and anxiety, I know that feeling. And I cannot imagine a worse indignity than to lump people who said, I can't do this anymore, and who are not here to defend themselves against being lumped in with murderers. So I hope that we don't do that we don't just say gun violence, that if we're going to talk about it, we'll talk about it individually. And I went over, and so David gets 20 extra seconds on the next thing we talk about. So thank you guys for being here.
Thank you. We will now move on to the moderated portion of the debate. First question. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Concisely describe your interpretation of the Second Amendment, including what, if any, limits on the possession of firearms are compatible with it. David?
How long do we have for this section?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. So one, I want to address the fact that if we had if we had the most historically accurate, one of my final papers I wrote in college was on, what would the most accurate interpretation today of the Second Amendment look like, putting aside as much as possible, obviously, my own biases, trying to look at what do the constitutional scholars say. So in one of these cases, there's a great book called A Well-Regulated Militia that breaks down a lot of the laws that were around at the time of the founding of the country and what a well-regulated militia actually looked like. And basically the closest interpretation to what we would have today if we did have a Second Amendment that was as aligned as possible with what the founders wanted is not something I think that I would be happy with, and I also don't think it's something that Spike would be happy with. Because what it would mean is effectively every 18 to 45-year-old man, white man in particular in the United States, would be required or either provided an M16. And the federal government would be allowed to come into your house and ensure, without a warrant, that you actually have that firearm in the first place. I think none of us wants that to be the case for multiple reasons on both sides of this table. I think, to me, I hear the comments that he says about the lower gun death rates and everything. I'd like to bring up a counter to that, which is the fact that Massachusetts actually has the highest standard of ownership in terms of how hard it is to get a gun in this country, and it has a 70% lower gun death rate than the US national average. And in Massachusetts, it's not necessarily easy to get a gun, but personally, I don't believe it necessarily should be, because part of having a well-regulated militia, we understand in the context of what that meant, was well-trained, obviously, because they wanted to ensure that at the time they were worried about having standing armies for obvious reasons. They needed to have well-trained people to serve in the place of that army. And to me, what the closest interpretation, what I would like to see in the future, my dream scenario is not one where everybody has their guns taken away. It's one where we federalize Massachusetts state gun laws. And that's not necessarily going to prevent all gun violence, I'll be the first to admit that, but I believe it can lead to a substantial reduction in it. I have more to say on the suicide aspect, but my time is up.
Thank you. Spike, your response?
Yeah, so I think it's important to look at what the founders said. And so let's start with the guy who wrote the Second Amendment. Whereas civil rulers may attempt to tyrannize, and as the military forces, which must be occasionally raised to defend the country, might pervert their power to the injury of their fellow citizens, the people are confirmed by this article, the Second Amendment, in their right to keep and bear their private arms. The writer of the Second Amendment was very clear. This is confirming a pre-existing individual natural right for you to keep and bear arms, and he's explicitly mentioning the fact that you should be able to do that, if necessary, to rise up against your own government. Keep in mind, this was a revolutionary government that was being created right after a violent revolution to remove the previous rulers. That is the intent of the Second Amendment. I don't know of any founders who indicated that they were mandating the use of firearms or the ownership of firearms. David, I'm happy to hear your thoughts on that if there was that did. I've not seen anything to that. It's that every person should be able to their own ability and volition, be able to be armed and trained in that so that we have a large pool from which to draw for a militia if necessary. I want to address what David said. David is correct. Massachusetts is definitely on the lower scale of all violent crime, including that with a gun. Of the 10 lowest murder rates, Massachusetts is among them. 8 of the other states have permitless carry. So what it turns out is that this is a chart. I don't know if you guys can see this, but in this chart, I hope you all have eagle eye vision. Those at home may be able to see it. This is the number of guns per people, or rate of gun ownership by in that state, and this is the gun murder rate. So not just the murder rate, but the murder rate by gun. And what you'll notice is it looked like I dropped a bunch of sprinkles on the page. There's no correlation between gun ownership or ease of access to guns and homicide rates.
That is your time.
If it would look like this if that were true. Anyway, go ahead.
Thank you. David, a 30-second response.
Okay. Anybody that's taken a basic statistics class knows that there are 3 types of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. That's what I think that is.
Okay.
And let me explain why. Sorry. I have to, first of all, can I see that?
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I can understand the data that you're
Yeah, and this has the what's cited there, yeah.
So I need more time to look at this chart, obviously, but from my understanding based off of what Spike said, it's easy to understand that in a state like Vermont, people are going to own a lot more guns per person. But guess what? There's also less people in Vermont. You know where there's a lot of people? Massachusetts. It's an urban state, and it still has an incredibly low gun death rate.
Right, so that's per capita.
Spike,
Sorry.
Your 30 seconds. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Okay. Right, so that's per capita. So the number of people wouldn't actually matter because it's per capita. So by the way, this is also international. How much time do I have?
30 seconds.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll get into that later because I know where that'll go. You're right that there are different layouts, but if you look, that's a mix of rural, suburban, urban states. It turns out that there are a lot of other factors, ones which I believe that we would agree on, things like the prevalence of the war on drugs, overcriminalization, and things like that that contribute to death. Putting a fine point on this, it ain't the guns, which is my point.
No.
Next question. Polling shows that a plurality of the U.S. population consistently desires stricter gun control. Should any right be unassailable by a Democratic majority? And if so, does that right protected by the Second Amendment fit this bill?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Polling shows that a plurality of the U.S. population consistently desires stricter gun control. Should any right be unassailable by a Democratic majority? And if so, does that right protected by the Second Amendment fit this bill?
No.
Spike, you can start.
So I recently saw a poll that said that 64% of Americans supported the Bruin decision, which basically said that almost all, if not all, gun control is unconstitutional. So I'm interested in that statistic. I will also say that there was a poll done a few years ago where 30% of people who were polled said that they supported bombing Agrabah in order to reduce terrorism. Agrabah is the fictional city in Disney's Aladdin. It is for that reason that, no, I never support allowing your individual pre-existing natural rights to be infringed upon based on what a majority vote means. I shouldn't have to explain to everyone in here what the history of the majority deciding what the minority is or is not allowed to do look like. By the way, part of what that looks like is gun control. In the Dred Scott decision in 1857, Chief Justice Taney said, well, of course we can't treat black people like people in this country. If we did, they'd be able to own firearms and carry them wherever they wanted. Gun control is actually one of the best examples of what happens when you let a majority population decide that a minority population shouldn't be allowed to exercise some of their rights. It looks like a large group of racist white people telling black people you're not allowed to own firearms for your safety.
Thank you. David, your
You
response?
get my extra 40 seconds.
Wow, thank you for your donation. First of all, I want to say one thing that this chart does not cover are exactly the 2/3 of gun deaths that he was talking about. If we actually saw the gun suicides on this chart, it would look a lot different, because that's the most common type of gun death in this country. That's 2/3 of gun deaths. To address the question more directly, obviously now, first of all, that is not how America works. We don't simply vote where all of a sudden we have a massive country. As far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, Spike, I've never heard of this constitutional procedure where any American, we can just say, you know what, we're gonna have a ballot measure in this country and we're all gonna agree whether or not the Second Amendment exists. That is not how that works
that's
at
how
all.
it works.
So I think
Thankfully.
there's a flaw in that question, for one, because it's completely irrelevant, frankly, in some ways, because that is not how that is handled. Not to mention the fact that I wouldn't agree with that. There's a reason why we have a representative democracy in the first place. I don't disagree that we should be able to just say, because the majority of Americans don't want something, that it shouldn't be a right by any means. That absolutely should not be the case.
Of course.
But let's be clear, too, in that it is possible both to have a First Amendment and also not have people yelling, screaming that there's a fire in a crowded theater. With all rights, there are limitations to them. There is no right that is completely unlimited, including the Second Amendment. What I'm advocating for here is simple limitations on this. That is not saying that nobody in this country can have guns or anything like that. What I'm advocating for is a higher standard of ownership in this country, while also addressing the fact that I do think Spike and I, although I don't think we're going to end up discussing this much because of our limited time, there are areas that we do agree, such as around the criminalization aspect, addressing poverty, addressing the systemic factors that play into driving gun violence as well, that I think are actually also very important for us to focus on, along with those 2/3 of gun deaths. And Spike, I'm going to take that 40 seconds it was 40 seconds, right?
40 seconds. You got 42 seconds left.
So in those 40 seconds, I'll just talk about gun suicide in particular. Let's be clear. Somebody who wants to kill themselves and is very determined on doing so is likely going to do so if they are extremely determined. But the reality is, with a gun, you rarely get a second chance. So 90% of people who attempt suicide and survive their first attempt do not reattempt. But the odds of surviving an attempt of suicide with a firearm are less than 10% typically. But the most common type of suicide attempt is actually drug overdoses. Most people, about 90%, survive that. With a firearm, in places like this, where Spike likes to point out, well, in Vermont, they have tons of guns and a much lower gun death rate. The reality is that the suicide rate is still much higher. And if people get that second chance, because there are stronger regulations, like just a waiting day period, the better off you'll be.
I want David's additional 10 seconds he just got.
Go ahead. I donate
so
them
now
back.
I get 40 seconds instead of 30 seconds. You actually can say fire in a crowded theater. I'm going to be the libertarian who's going to focus on the least important thing. You can say fire in a crowded theater. The decision in which a justice said that you can't was used to justify an act in the Alien and Sedition Acts that was later ruled to be unconstitutional. If you yell fire in a crowded theater, you'll be trespassed, but you didn't actually break a law by saying that. The First Amendment is every bit as inviolable as the Second Amendment. Second of all, you are correct about suicides. And I was actually compelled by the fact that there hasn't been any study that has shown that gun control reduces suicide rates. And I was surprised by that because you are correct. Someone who uses a gun to commit suicide is more likely to succeed, unfortunately. But we've seen the data. It doesn't actually, gun control, we haven't, and I'd love to hear from David on this, but gun control.
Your time is up.
Yes. Just give him my time, I'm sorry.
Keep moving.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
But David, your final 30-second response on this question.
Yeah. So let's ask ourselves for a second, guys, why don't we have that research a lot of the time? Why is there such a limited amount of research on gun violence? Part of it is because it was illegal. The NRA lobbied to make it illegal even to study the effectiveness of state gun laws. Just as one statistic for you all, the rate of about a similar number of people die every year, from my understanding in research, from guns, including gun suicides, as die from sepsis every year in the United States. You know how much money the federal government typically puts in every year to study sepsis? It's $1 billion. Until I was 18, for the first 18 years of my life, the federal government gave pretty much $0 to study gun violence.
All right, moving on to the next question, which is quite related to something that you guys have already brought up. In 2023, there were over 40,000 gun deaths in the United States. A little over half of these were suicides. with most of the rest being homicides. Should action be taken to address this problem? And if so, what does the solution look like? David.
How long? 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
Yes, obviously action should be taken to address this problem. I think the first step is actually not even something related to gun laws. I think it is massively scaling the amount of research funding that we're putting into the CDC and NIH to study what gun laws actually are effective, and not just gun laws, but what programs are the most effective at reducing gun violence. That doesn't just mean addressing laws, but addressing things like violence intervention programs that the federal government has started to invest in more, but we still don't know how effective they are because we don't have enough research on it. I think the other way that it looks like is doing what we did. What I'm talking about here, what I want to do is not some crazy thing that's, some completely new policy invention. My dream scenario is just doing what we did with Obamacare, where we took that from Massachusetts and federalized it, and doing the same thing with Massachusetts state gun laws that thus far have been ruled largely constitutional, despite Bruin, and proven largely effective, even in an urban state like Massachusetts, where, unlike in Vermont, people actually live less than a mile from each other in Massachusetts. And guess what? If you live that far from somebody, you're a lot less likely to get in a fight with them and potentially harm them than you are in a place like Boston, for example. And I think the other thing that we need to do is also have a holistic approach where we aren't just addressing how somebody gets a gun, although I obviously care about that. We need to address the fact that, frankly, the reason why shootings don't happen, and I agree in some respects with Spike on this, the reason why gun violence doesn't happen every day in a place like Parkland, I'll be the first to say, is not because we have the strongest gun laws in the country or the most police officers. It's because the median household income in Parkland is over $100,000 a year. And people having opportunity and hope, people having jobs, people not needing to struggle to get by is one of the best ways of preventing violence, and that doesn't even deal with gun laws. And if Spike wants to work on that, I'm more than willing to have that conversation and work on that together to figure out what we can do there. Because I don't believe that everything is like you either have to completely agree on everything or you just can't work together. I think there are common grounds here that we can work on together.
Yeah,
Spike?
no, I agree. There are many other factors involved that we need to deal with. I'm sorry, I forgot your question. Oh, 40,000 gun deaths. So when you look at gun deaths, they broadly go into 5 different categories. Suicide, which is nearly 2/3. Murders, which have been steadily dropping. There is a multi-decade trend of the steady dropping of the murder rate over time, even as there are more and more guns per people in this country, 420 or so million and counting, about 13 million a year being added to that. Then you have justified killings, which have actually kind of been going down as well, because when there's less crime, there's less people killing the criminals that are victimizing them. You have police shootings, which also have been going down roughly the same as the crime rates going down, because less crime equals less police interactions equals less police shootings. There's also been a lot more police accountability, not nearly enough, and I think David agrees with me on that, but there has been some measures that have reduced the number of shootings as well. And then finally, accidents, which have dropped by 90% in the last 40 years. As a result of safer, better manufacturing of guns, and also because of more access to training on how to properly use the guns. Interestingly enough, most of that has happened during the time that there are fewer and fewer states that require any kind of licensing or permits to own guns. So we're seeing that if there was ever an argument that licensing reduced accidents, it certainly doesn't. They're reducing on their own. The reason that the gun violence rate is going up is because after many years of going down, the suicide rate is going back up. And I think if we're looking at gun violence as a whole and realizing that literally every other form of gun violence is dropping except for suicide, this is not a gun problem. It is a suicide problem. And the committing of suicide is increasing from all types of usage, including guns. That is what we are looking at here.
All right, as a follow-up question, why does the U.S. have this problem when other developed nations do not? 1 minute response, David.
It's the guns. Hate to break it to you guys. I mean, you want to talk about graphs? I wish that I had my own printout of a graph of the countries that own the relationship between the rate of firearm ownership and the gun homicide rate, even putting aside the suicides. There's a pretty strong correlation with all these developed countries, even the ones that have stronger gun laws like Switzerland, which, by the way, if you want to get a gun in Switzerland, it's not this libertarian utopia where
No,
you can
it's
just
not.
easily get one, to be clear.
Yeah.
You know, the NRA likes to talk about that all the time. That is not the case. How much time do I have? 30 seconds?
A minute.
It's the guns. Really, at the end of the day, like all these other countries, if you look at the countries that have the highest rates of gun violence, they also have poverty. They also have systemic racism. They also have all these other forms of systematic injustice that I agree that we need to address. But the reality is it is far harder for what happened in Parkland to happen in Switzerland or in the UK or in almost any other highly developed country than it was in the United States.
Spike, 1 minute response.
Yeah, so an example of systemic racism is putting a young black man in jail for owning a gun that he wouldn't have had any trouble owning if he lived up the road in a whiter and wealthier area. Putting that aside, you said you don't have a chart. I have many charts. So there was a guy whose name escapes me. He did a study where he used data from UNSCAR, or UNSCAR. It's a UN organization that is looking at arms regulations and how they relate to homicides, and it is with a pro-gun control bent that they have. And they looked at the data, and they looked at the rate of gun ownership and the rate of gun murders. And again, if this chart, no one sees it, but basically these dots would all do this if there was a correlation between gun murders and gun ownership rates. There aren't. Look, here's America. Pretty low on the international scale of gun murders, and way over here. All the other countries are over here. We're way over here. So internationally, now you may say, Spike, but that's not just looking at specific countries. Well, he also did a study on the ones with the low homicide rates only, no correlation. He looked at the countries with the highest murder rates. They decided to put America here. We're down at the bottom, no correlation. Looked at the European countries, no correlation. There's no correlation between gun ownership and gun homicides.
30-second response, David.
You need a whiteboard like Katie Porter. I think just anecdotally, I mean, the fact of the matter is, I don't know how many of you have studied abroad or been overseas in some of these more developed countries. I don't know about you, but I feel a certain sense of relief when I am over there because I know that gun violence is far less likely in general. It is something that we intuitively know is just the case. Gun deaths, there's a reason why school shootings are not happening every day in the UK or in Australia or in any of these other high-income countries, and it's not because they have more guns than we do. It's not because they have police officers in their schools. I could go on, but we just know that.
And Spike, final 30 seconds on this question.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the fact is that data proves what it does. And the thing about anecdotes is that even if, I mean, you're a nation of 350 million people, if the homicide rate was 0.000001, there would still be dozens or hundreds, whatever that works out to, horrific stories of people being, hurt with guns. That's the reality of the things. That's why we have to look at the data, because that data represents people being murdered and individual stories. I can't tell you about feelings of safety, but I feel pretty darn safe here, and this is one of the places where someone is most likely to have guns. I'm not saying guns in and of themselves make us safer. I'm saying that they don't really have an immediate say on whether we're safer or not, and by trying to centrally plan who has guns, we're taking them away largely from peaceful, law-abiding people, which means the only people left with guns are the ones who don't care what the laws are, and that doesn't make us any safer.
All right. Moving on to the next question. In addition to our very high rate of gun violence compared to other developed nations, the U.S. leads these nations in mass shootings and leads the entire world in school shootings. Why are these tragedies more frequent in the United States, and what should be done to protect American children? David.
First of all, I just need to address the fact that this source, this source, this source, and this source, if I turned them in, I would have gotten an F in college, because they're all from Wikipedia.
No, they're Wikipedia.
The source says it's Wikipedia.
Okay,
It's from
I'm
a.
just-
Well,
I
no,
just
hold on.
wanted
No,
to
I
point
want
that
to.
out.
Okay. No, I'll respond.
Let's move
Go
on
ahead.
to
Go
this
ahead.
question.
Beyond that, what was the question?
Here, yeah. Reset his thing so he can. Yeah.
In addition to the high rate of gun violence in the United States, we lead developed nations in mass shootings and lead the entire world in school shootings. Why are these tragedies more frequent in the United States, and what should be done to protect American children?
Well, I think it's pretty, you're probably going to not be surprised by my answer. It's the guns. The fact of the matter is we have pretty much the highest rate of firearm ownership of almost any country, at least any large country in the world. Naturally, when that happens, you're going to have more instances of gun violence, of gun suicide, and mass shootings as well. And how much time do I have for this one? It's
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay, great. And look, the other day, I don't know if anybody saw a different presidential candidate, RFK Jr., really amazing guy, obviously. He was talking about how the reason why gun violence is so prevalent in the United States is because of antidepressants and violent video games. I didn't know that America was the only country where people took antidepressants and played violent video games. The difference is in these other countries, it's a hell of a lot harder to get a damn gun, frankly. That's why these shootings don't have nearly as much gun violence. Of course, there is a cultural component that we have to address as well. But the reality is, it is a lot harder, even if you're somebody, there's all these people that say all the time, David, gun laws just don't work because criminals don't obey gun laws. But there's so much nuance that talking point leaves out. The shooter at my high school was a 19-year-old, and he was a criminal, but he was not a criminal mastermind. He was a 19-year-old that was able to legally go out and obtain an AR-15 with a high-capacity magazine and murder my classmates. He did not have connections to the cartel or the black market, right? Obviously, in some instances, people are still going to be able to get guns, but an instance like that, where somebody repeatedly threatened to shoot up a high school, not only should they have not been able to get an AR-15, and I don't believe that actually infringes on anybody's rights. I think it actually protects our rights to safety in the first place, right? I think that's just common sense, and that's what I'm advocating for. It's not a world where everybody, has their firearms taken away or anything like that. That is not what I want. Also, that would be logistically impossible and constitutionally impossible. But that's my opinion.
Spike, your response on
Yes.
school safety.
So first of all, I apologize for interrupting. I apologize for that. That was uncalled for. I'm glad you got your 30 seconds back. Second of all, the Wikipedia listings are of the data that was reported to UNSCAR, both of the firearms rates the firearms per person rate and the homicide rate, which I actually believe is the data reported by the individual country's governments. So that's where that's listed, but it's not, the source isn't, trust me, bro, I saw it on Wikipedia. If it was, you would be 100% correct to call me out on that. So when it comes to the US, we had basically no mass shootings or no school shootings in this country up until a relatively recent period of time. From 1949 into the 1960s, there were basically no mass shootings until the late 1960s. This was at a time when students routinely brought guns to school, and many schools had shooting ranges where they taught shooting and proper gun use. So again, the problem, at least in America, was not the guns. In 1990, the Crime Control Act was passed. And as part of the Crime Control Act, what they did was they said that it was, at the federal level, it was illegal to carry firearms on any school property. They also introduced SROs, student resource officers. Yeah, I know you're not a fan either. And as David can tell you as well, an SRO has never stopped a school shooting, not a single one. What they have done is abuse children. They have been caught including sexually abusing children. Not all of them, but this has happened. If it even happened once, it happened more than one time that they ever stopped a shooting. They are not useful. So basically what the federal government did is said any peaceful law-abiding person in this school is not allowed to own firearms, and we're going to over-police it as well. In other words, they introduced the conditions that it imposed on the inner city into government-run schools, and lo and behold, we suddenly started having school shootings. That's what caused that.
That is your time.
Oh, that is my time. Okay, I'll address the assault weapons thing next.
Get a 1-minute response?
I mean, like, the fact of the matter is, gun technology has vastly improved since that era. Semi-automatic rifles make up, like the AR-15, they make up 25% of all gun sales in this country at this point. Those guns are not made necessarily to defend yourself. They were originally developed from a variant of the M16 that was originally developed as part of a competition. I could go into the whole history of it, but it was made effectively for the US military. And those weapons are made for the jungles of Vietnam. They are not made necessarily to defend yourself. And frankly, if you're defending yourself with a rifle from 1,000 feet away, unless you're in a place that's really I mean, it is hard to imagine really any compelling argument to why that's the case, especially considering the fact for most of US history, you actually had a duty to retreat. You had, even on your own property, you had to prove that your life was so in danger that you had no other choice but to kill that person. But what we've seen with the passage of laws like Stand Your Ground is more gun responsibility, it's more irresponsible salesmanship and gun ownership where people shoot first and ask questions later.
Spike, 1 minute response.
Yeah, so I believe that standard of having to retreat started in the 1940s with the Model Penal Code, which was explicitly added in order to make it harder for marginalized people to claim that they were defending themselves. Prior to that, we had decisions like Bad Elk versus Oklahoma, where a Native American killed 2 police officers who were attempting to arrest him, and the federal government ruled that he was within his rights because they weren't in the right jurisdiction. That's what it used to be. Anyway, back to the, I'll go to the assault rifles thing. David's right. There are 25 million and counting assault-style rifles in this country. There are about, I believe, 3 million, give or take, being added to that every year. And you are more likely to be beaten to death than you are to be killed by someone wielding an assault rifle. You're 3 times more likely to be stabbed, and you're something like 17, maybe it's 14, but it's in the teens, times more likely to be killed with a pistol. So that's really, it is, and that's with any rifle, including hunting rifles, not just assault rifles. It is why in 2004, the Department of Justice, no, go ahead. No,
Let him have his time, go ahead.
It's just that one sentence. In 2004, the Department of Justice determined in a study that the assault weapons ban had either no effect on the murder rate in the US or so little effect that it could not be measured.
Okay, as a follow-up question on the topic of schools, should schools be gun-free zones? And should schools arm teachers or increase armed security?
Folks, how much, 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
Like, you're going to notice one common theme with most of the things that, again, I have a lot of respect for Spike as a person. I just don't agree with him on the issues that we're arguing about, obviously. The reality is a lot of what he's bringing up is going to have one common theme. It's selling more guns. Because that is what we've done. We've created a society and a system of incentives for the gun manufacturers where they are protected from liability because they're one of the pretty much there are 3 industries in the United States that cannot be held civilly liable. They are the MLB, nuclear energy companies, and the firearms industry. And the only exception to that is if you manufacture a firearm and it is improperly used and it goes off and blows up in somebody's face. But I do think schools should be gun-free zones because I think they should be schools and not prisons. I think that they should be schools and not police states for our children. I think that there's actually a strong libertarian argument to be made that having guns in our schools endangers the future of our country because we're effectively grooming our children to believe that they're safe nowhere in many ways, and it makes them more compelled to believe that they need, that they just can't be safe in the first place. And I think, let's just, for a second, to answer the arming teachers question, how many of you have ever had an argument with your teacher or professor? How would you feel if that person had a Glock 19? Right? Well, good for you, sir. I don't think most of the students in this room, and I'm sure there are some that don't agree, but the reality is human beings are incredibly emotional and stupid creatures, and adding guns into these situations is going to make it deadly. I don't care how much training somebody has, even law enforcement officers, you cannot train out instincts from them, and you can't train out the fact that, did anybody see recently at a Chipotle, somebody got their order wrong and a guy pulled out a gun on the manager? When you're adding more guns into our society, that is far more, statistically speaking, what is going to happen than people just reasonably having them and being calm. Because people have road rage, people are emotional, and even if they're well-trained, which I know is not necessarily what Spike is advocating for unless it's by a non-government agency, I don't want to mischaracterize what you're saying, you're going to have more instances of gun violence. It's just what's going to happen.
Spike, 2 minute response.
Oh, it's 2 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. Can you start over? Because my reaction to that was like 5 seconds.
Sorry.
And I thought, I thought I only had 30 seconds, so the joy of that. Sorry. Okay.
Yes.
I'm not.
2 minutes on should schools be gun-free zones or should we increase armed security in schools?
Yeah, no. Actually, I'm not sure either. I don't think that the SRO model it's a terrible, terrible model. Over-policing is a bad idea. We have too many cops. And I think we probably both agree on that. We have too many cops and we have too many laws. And if there is going to be any kind of security in schools, or especially in schools, they shouldn't be there as law enforcement officers, because cops are hammers and everyone's a nail. And we shouldn't be treating students as nails. So I think we agree on that. When it comes to guns, in the United States, American schools were as safe from school shootings as our European peers prior to 1990 with the introduction of the Crime Control Act, where we, again, imposed the conditions of the inner city, saying if you are someone who cares about what our signs say you can and can't do, you can't have a firearm. Oh, but if you're a potential school shooter or a criminal, you need to know that you'll be the only one in here without a firearm, except for the SROs. They're going to run away. And then if you start shooting, we're going to call the police, and they will stand outside and wait for the gunfire to stop, and then you get to decide whether you want to die in a hail of bullets or turn yourself in. If you are someone who has decided to rack up a body count of people, then basically the sign might as well say, this is your oyster, come and get it. And that is what a so-called no-gun zone looks like. That's why 94% of all mass shootings have happened in so-called no-gun zones. We are saying if you are peaceful, you can't have a gun. If you aren't peaceful, you also can't have a gun, but you don't care what the laws are. I want to address liability. I got enough time for this. Yes, the PLCCA or PLCAA says that if a firearms manufacturer makes something faulty, then they should be liable for that, but not if someone uses their gun to do something illegal. That's true of everything. We didn't sue Ford because Darrell Brooks used a Ford Escape to ram down and kill dozens of people during the Waukesha Christmas parade a few years back, because it wasn't Ford's fault. And it's not Colt's fault if someone uses their AR-15.
Thank you. David, a 30-second response.
I mean, the fact of the matter is, I don't know about you all, but last I heard, schools in Europe are also gun-free zones. When was the last time that we heard about a school shooting there? Maybe it's because they don't have guns nearly as much as we do. Just saying. The other thing is, I think that there's an important distinction. I think there's actually a strong libertarian argument to be made about why these companies should be held civilly liable, which is the fact that it's an important way of the market regulating itself. If you are saying that you are only selling to the most responsible gun owners and that you care so much about that, we should create a system of incentives where the only companies that can financially exist are ones that are responsibly selling these firearms to responsible individuals.
Spike, final 30 seconds on this question.
Anyone who has ever run a business would not want to be held liable for the possibility that someone might use their product illegally, and they're supposed to be psychics and know that. So that's not how liability works. Liability is if you, through abuse or malicious intent, or through either neglect with your product or malignant intent with your product, caused harm with your product, not if someone then uses it and commits a crime with it. Yeah, so I mean, that's the case with the liability thing. There are countries that have more shootings, including school shootings, and they have stricter restrictions. You'll notice he keeps mentioning Europe, but not Latin America or parts of Southeast Asia or parts of Africa or parts of Eastern Europe, but only Central and Western Europe. There are many other countries that have more restrictions and more shootings.
But we are trying
go
to
ahead.
keep this
Nope,
moving
go ahead.
because we have a lot of questions to get through. So the United States previously had an assault weapons ban from 1994 to 2004, but research into the results and whether it helped gun violence have been inconclusive. Would you support the U.S. reinstating the assault weapons ban? Spike?
No. The Department of Justice report was conclusive in that it could not show that there was any reduction in any kind of in the murder rate or the gun murder rate. And there's a reason for that. In fact, interestingly enough, there was a drop in the murder rate during that time. There was also a record amount of sales of semi-automatic rifles. And by the way, I do take one issue with what you said. You said that I am trying to sell guns. You are probably the single greatest salesperson for guns. Every time you speak about restricting guns, impulsively, people go out and purchase guns. So thank you for that. I'm not thanking you. I don't care if you sell guns or not. The reality is that there are more guns than people. That ratio continues to grow, and there has been a long-term drop in the murder rate. And so that, to me, really just sums it up. If guns were the problem, we'd have more murder. This would be, if guns were in and of themselves the problem, We would not be sitting here in Hanover talking about why things are so bad in Baltimore. We would be in Baltimore talking about why things are so bad in Hanover. It is not a gun problem. There are many, many other factors. And then yes, when criminality ensues, a gun is an effective tool to kill people, and they'll probably use that. But if you were able to magically take away all the firearms only from criminals, they'd use another tool. Because again, guns are not the problem, and if they were, we'd see it borne out in the data. Even at the national level, this is the Gifford score with gun control. The Gifford score, it didn't matter how much gun control a state had, it was all over the place when it came to murder. Oh, except for DC. DC has some of the strictest gun control, and it had such a high murder rate compared to the 50 states that it literally compressed all the other data because it was like more than double the highest murder rate of any of the states.
David, 2-minute response on assault weapons ban.
Yeah, well, I do want to address earlier, this idea, at least this one's not from Wikipedia. But earlier, there was this discussion, car manufacturers are not held accountable to these things, but the reality is there have been instances where people and industries have purposely and intentionally sold extremely lethal and dangerous items to unknowing consumers that have had deadly effects, and it's called big tobacco. And it was because they were able to hold them liable with similar lawsuits that PLACA, the law that we're talking about, prevents, that we cannot continue the same course of action that we took with big tobacco. Guess what? You can still smoke cigarettes in this country. You just have to be of a certain age, and there's public health campaigns around it. That's the same approach I want to take with guns. I don't want a society where no guns exist. I like shooting guns. I was part of the shooting club. I thoroughly enjoy it. But I understand that there's responsibility that comes with that in the first place. And I know in this polarized world, it can be hard to be able to understand both those things at the same time. I personally believe that the real danger is not stopping gun violence in the first place, because we will get to a point in our society where people start thinking the only thing we can do is take everybody's guns. And I don't want that to happen. We have to address this. And to address the actual question at hand, in terms of the, what was the question?
Assault weapons ban.
Thank you. Look, I think we need to modify the assault weapons ban. We need to have a more nuanced approach to it. We need to address the fact that there are multiple loopholes in the assault weapons ban. There are many ways that you could get around it. And we also need to have a new way of, frankly, defining assault weapons, because there's so many different ways that you could legally define it that there's a lot of problems with that regulation in the first place. And I also want to say, in this chart that they have here, what it doesn't address is the fact that, guess what? Even if a state has stronger gun laws, you can easily traffic it from another state because of our lack of federal gun laws. But you know what could do something about that? Something like a 1 gun per month policy that makes it a lot harder and uneconomical to transport guns into a place like DC and sell them on the street. Not to mention the problems with enforcing laws in DC because of the multiple jurisdictions that overlap there. But it is a problem, and we have to address, as somebody who lives in DC, we have to address the violence. There was a shooting from a block from me a week ago. It is still a problem, and we have to address it.
As a follow-up question.
Sorry, it wasn't a week ago, it was like a month ago.
Related to what you were saying, the assault weapons ban only restricted certain kinds of semi-automatic rifles. Was this enough, and how would you define an assault weapon?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to understanding. Well, is this your part, Spike? Or?
No,
sorry, I thought we were switching on and off.
Just 1 minute.
Well, for one, I think we need to understand that there are different ways that you could define an assault weapon. The way that I would typically characterize it, more broadly speaking, is a semi-automatic rifle capable of taking a high-capacity magazine, somewhere in the range of, 30 rounds or more than 10 rounds. My apologies. That is how I define it. And the reason why I define it that way is because what makes these guns especially lethal, for anybody that has shot them before, you will understand why a rifle is far more lethal. It's easier to aim, and especially because of the high-capacity magazines, that is just not really practical with a lot of things like a handgun, and the increased accuracy of a gun like the AR-15 in comparison to a Glock 19 or a Sig Sauer handgun, for example, or something like that. It is just far more lethal. Not to mention that the bullets themselves are traveling at typically three times faster. Like a 5.56 is going to be going way faster than a 9mm round, and just in terms of the pure physics of that, it is way more damaging to human tissue. But both are obviously still lethal, to be clear.
Spike, 1 minute response.
Wow. Yeah, I don't even know where to start. So yeah, you can traffic guns between different states, but that would be true of the high crime states and low crime states. So it's not, the reason it doesn't address that is because it's addressing gun control and the murder rate, and there's no correlation between them. And if trafficking was a problem, then I could see them even closer than they are. Anyway, so when it comes to the, how long do I have?
1 minute.
Good. When it comes to the assault weapons, if we used your definition, that would include a lot of kids hunting rifles, but also if we saw that these assault weapons were such an exigent threat to us that we had to violate the Second Amendment to limit what kind of firearm you could have, we would see that with these 25 million and counting, it might be 30 million at this point, assault rifles, and this is just AR and AK style rifles that we have in this country, there'd be thousands or tens of thousands of murders a year. There's less than, it was I think 540 at last count, and that included that was with any kind of rifle compared to thousands with a pistol.
I'm sorry, but to follow up, Spike, what do you believe about regulating, or would you support any kind of regulation of 3D printed or other kinds of ghost guns?
No. No. In the
1 minute.
1 minute. No. In two recent decisions, two recent court cases, Vanderstock and the other name is escaping me, the ATF and the Attorney General of whatever state introduced it were asked to provide evidence that ghost guns, which are just the newest scary term for home manufactured firearms, it used to be Saturday Night Special back in my day, that's how old I am, that they could show that ghost guns were tied to a higher level of crime. The ATF and that Attorney General both declined to do so because there isn't any evidence that they provide that they're any more dangerous or more likely to be used in crime or anything else. I want to address the tobacco liability because that is a good point that we held tobacco companies liable because they intentionally hid data showing that there were health problems with smoking tobacco, and there is no safe way to use tobacco. Neither of those are true when it comes to guns. Gun manufacturers have not hidden anything when it comes to guns. Everyone knows what guns can be used for, and guns are far more likely to be used safely or to be used to defend people than to kill people. There are millions of cases every single year of defensive gun use compared to about, I think at this point we're down to, as it's lowering, 15,000 murders by gun a year.
Thanks. 1 minute response, David.
First of all, the data that Spike is probably referring to, I imagine, when it comes to the defensive gun use, typically is chalked up from the NRA, and it's self-reported scores. And if you go through their website, you can actually look at the specific instances where they report this. It's pretty hilarious, actually, in some instances. Because I want to be clear, it's important that somebody, if their life is in danger, that they are able to defend themselves. But a lot of the stories that the NRA is telling us about that to make up these statistics, saying that there are millions of instances of this, there was one of them that I saw where it was to defend somebody's property from a wild boar in Texas. I would not necessarily consider that defending yourself publicly from, it's a mischaracterization of acting like, oh, it's just all these criminals that are being stopped. Of course, that person, if they needed to, I'm glad that they're able to protect themselves. But the reality is there's a lot of murkiness that the NRA intentionally puts into this. It's also self-reported. It's not scientific. And you know what I would actually like to have with that? Research that the NRA has actively advocated against us being able to have because they passed a law called the Dickey Amendment that made it illegal for the CDC and NIH to study the effectiveness of state gun laws, which has since been repealed, but I would love to see research that included what defensive gun use looks like from an independent third party. That is not the NRA.
All right. Sorry, but we do need to move on to the next
Okay,
question.
all right, no problem.
Do you support voluntary gun buybacks or a national registry of gun sales? Spike,
Are we
you can
starting
start
with
on
me?
this.
I just
1
have to
minute.
say, leave it to David Hogg to say that we shouldn't be able to defend ourselves against wild boars. No, I know, that was terrible. No one should have laughed at that. None of my studies were from the NRA. They're from CNN, the Pew Research Center, Washington Post, Gallup, Hemingway, Azriel, and Miller. They range from between, I think the lowest one here is 900,000 a year and 4.03 million a year. Even if that's only a fraction of those are true.
Can you focus on the question?
Okay,
please?
fair enough. So the question again.
Do you support voluntary gun buybacks or a national registry of gun sales?
No, especially not the registry, but the gun buybacks. I'm actually surprised that March for Our Lives supports this because I've yet to see a single study that shows that gun buybacks, which first of all, they're not buybacks, they belong to you, the government didn't own them and you're selling them back to them, but regardless, I've yet to see a single study that showed that there was any kind of reduction of any kind of violent crime at all from gun buybacks. In fact, many left-wing organizations that support gun control are saying we need to abandon these gun buybacks. They don't do anything. They're virtue signaling for police officers to say, look at all these dangerous six-shooters and hunting rifles we've taken off the street. There's been no demonstration that they work, and frankly, was 1 minute?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm done then.
David, 1 minute response. Would you support any voluntary gun buybacks or a national registry of gun sales?
Yeah, like, I mean, I think if somebody doesn't want a gun in their household because it was passed down to them, like, there should be a clear set. People are unfortunately not born naturally understanding how to handle firearms properly. And I think it would be great if everybody did know how to do that, especially in a country with so many guns in the first place. But it's important to acknowledge that that is just not the case, right? And even if it was, if somebody doesn't want to have a firearm in their household because they have kids or whatever other reason, there should be a clear, straightforward way for them to remove that firearm from their house and give it back with a financial incentive from the government. Because, while I don't know about those statistics that you brought up about the murder rate, we do know that having a firearm in your household makes suicide in that house 5 times more likely than if that firearm was not there. We also know that children are often accessing these firearms because they're not properly stored, because these individuals don't store them because they think, oh, I need to be able to access this in the moment where somebody is breaking into my house, when the reality is a lot of the time it's a lot more likely that a child in your house gets a hold of that gun than you successfully defending yourself against it. So do I support a buyback? Yes, but I also want to answer the other part of the question, which is a registration system. Yes, I do support that. I think it's common sense, and I think if we're going to enforce these laws or have any chance of enforcing them, we do need to have a registration system. And I know that's terrifying to a lot of you, but frankly, what's a lot more scary is not addressing this problem, to me.
Moving on to the next question, because we are running out of time. What other restrictions, if any, should be put on who may obtain or possess firearms? For example, do you support any of the following? Red flag laws, including restrictions on those convicted of domestic violence, universal background checks, an increase in the minimum age requirement for purchasing of firearms, or mandatory firearm safety courses as a condition of purchase. 2 minutes, David.
I'm just looking at the things that you...
Red flag laws, universal background checks, minimum age, and mandatory training.
I have 1 minute for this.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. All right, so I just want to start out on red flag laws. So far I believe Spike doesn't, you can answer this after this, but I don't believe that you support red flag laws in any way, shape, or form. But here's the reality. There is in many instances where we do have guns that are out there, like the instance of the shooter at my high school. He had the police called on him multiple times to his school, to his house. He was known to threaten to shoot up my high school. He was reported to law enforcement. And in part because we did not have that red flag law in place, we were not able to temporarily remove his firearms. There was an NRA supporter that sent a death threat to my own mother after the shooting that said, F with the NRA and you will be DOA. We used the law that we passed after Parkland, the red flag law, to disarm the man that lived 20 minutes away from us that threatened to kill my mother. And that same law since Parkland has been used over 12,000 times to disarm people that have been deemed by, not just by some random person or their neighbor, but by a court with a right to counsel and due process, that they are a danger to themselves or others. I don't believe that somebody who threatens to shoot up a high school should be able to have an AR-15. I believe that helps protect our right to be safe and ensure that there is a well-regulated militia in the first place, as is talked about in the Second Amendment, because somebody who threatens to shoot up a high school is not part of that. Do I support universal background checks? Yes, but we also need to acknowledge that we need to have a way of enforcing them as well, which would mean a registration system along with that. Do we need to increase the minimum age for purchasing some types of firearms? I believe we do. I don't think that if you can't have a beer when you're 18, you shouldn't be able to have an AR-15. And by the way, right now, under current federal law, the shooter at my high school would not have been able to buy from an FFL, federally licensed dealer, would not have been able to purchase a handgun because he was not over 21, but he was able to purchase an AR-15. That doesn't make sense to me, personally. And I know that Spike will say something about hunting or some other vague libertarian point, but I just don't think that that makes sense, personally.
Spike, your 2 minute response on red flag laws, universal background checks, and minimum age or mandatory firearms safety courses?
Yeah, sorry, I was writing them down, so I had them here. Yeah, so when it comes to the background checks, multiple studies done, none of them concluded that they had any meaningful reduction in the trend that was already existing of the lowering murder rate that's happening in every single state in this country. And he's correct. Universal background checks would also require some kind of gun registry. That's the first thing every government does before they want to oppress you, is they first have to register your guns so they know where they are, so that they can then disarm them and disarm you and take them from you. And then they can do basically essentially whatever you want. Lily Tang Williams, who survived Mao's Cultural Revolution, can tell you about that firsthand. So I definitely do not support that. Red flag laws, there's actually something you said that is incorrect, David. Red flag laws don't have due process. You often don't even know who accused you. And it can be an ex-spouse claiming that you said something without providing any evidence. But you won't know that because the police will just show up and tell you that they're going to take your gun. And if it's in a state that allows no knock warrants, they'll probably just get one of those so you don't even get a chance to answer your door. They just bust into your house to take it from you. And there's not really a clear way for you to ever fight to get your property back. And rather than spend tens of thousands of dollars to get back a gun that might be worth a few $100s, most people just let the state keep it anyway. So there is no due process. Both of the instances that you cited, all 50 states have in place procedures that involve due process to take guns from people that are an immediate exigent threat. And if that didn't work with Nicholas Cruz, I believe his name was, then the system there failed. But that doesn't mean you remove no due process for the rest of us to have to deal with. You have due process in place. Red flag laws failed in California with multiple shootings that have happened there. They failed in Maine with the Lewiston shooter. Red flag laws do nothing but give government another tool to violate your due process. So I don't support that. I agree with David. You should be able to drink alcohol when you're 18. But the reality is that you're more likely, I forget the exact age, but it's in your mid-20s that you're more likely to commit murder, not in your teens. So I don't believe that should be a limit there.
David, a 30-second response.
Well, I mean, you're setting a dangerous precedent if we wanted to talk about instances where certain laws have failed, because in that case, I can talk about every murder that's happened in the United States in states with permitless carry over and over again, right? Like, that is a logical fallacy. Is any law perfect? No, by no means. I will be the first to admit no law is perfect, but there's a reason we still have laws in the first place, right? What I'm advocating for, and frankly, in these states, there's differences with each of them with how they pass these red flag laws. I don't know, about which ones you're referring to in particular that have those egregious violations, other than California that at least you mentioned. But in Florida's case, those laws were passed by a very Republican state legislature. And guess who uses them most? It's not liberal sheriffs, it's Republican sheriffs. It's the Republican Sheriffs Association and others that support it because these laws work. Do I always agree with the police on everything? No, but yeah.
Spike, 30 seconds.
Yes, it is often used by Republican sheriffs. Donald Trump, by the way, is a huge fan of red flag laws. Take the guns first, due process later. And
Which I don't agree with, to be clear.
Well, that's what red flag laws are. But there is a very Republican sheriff in Colorado who used to be a big supporter of red flag laws until they were used twice against him by prison inmates. They said that they lived with him at his jail. Now he's no longer a supporter of red flag laws.
Thank you. To move on to our next question, perpetrators in school shootings and the victims of suicide often suffer from severe mental health issues. To what extent is gun violence a mental health problem? Spike, 2 minutes.
It is increasingly the problem. If we're calling gun violence, if we're saying gun violence is suicide, murder, justified killings, police shootings, and accidents, all of these are dropping. The only one that's increasing is suicides. So this is a mental health problem. It is growing, and if that trend continues, where everything else drops and suicide continues, you're going to reach a point where 90% of it is suicides. This is a suicide problem. And I poured through the data because I will admit I'm not an expert on the conditions that create leading people to want to kill themselves. I can tell you about my personal struggles with mental health, especially when I was around a lot of your age in my early 20s and mid 20s. But I don't know, broadly speaking, what they are. And I poured over the data, and even for groups that were trying to tie suicide to guns, none of them said that that was a reason that anyone was killing themselves. Hopelessness, depression, economic conditions, terminal illnesses, cries for help where they weren't actually intending to kill themselves, psychosis, substance abuse was a huge one. Those are the reasons people kill themselves. And I think we need to talk about that. And if we do that, we'll also be actually reducing the gun violence rate with something that actually addresses the problem and actually solves it and has basically nothing to do with guns. And he can have my 30 seconds.
Response?
Can you repeat the question?
To what extent is gun violence a mental health problem?
Like, we hear this characterization all the time, especially after mass shootings, typically after it's been a white mass shooter that's gone and committed some horrible atrocity. The fact of the matter is, the shooter in Buffalo, for example, he was not necessarily just mentally ill. More than that, he was a white supremacist, and a self-declared white supremacist at that. The same thing happened in El Paso, Texas at the Walmart shooting in 2019, where the shooter repeatedly talked about how much he thought there was a Hispanic invasion, quote unquote, and decided to go and use a weapon, I think it was an AR-15, to go and murder Mexican people. Hatred is not a mental illness, and we should not be stigmatizing mental health more to avoid talking about a major problem that I think Spike and I both agree on, which is systemic racism in this country, right? And that means policy-wise and also between individuals. In terms of, I think we can do both, frankly. I know that Spike doesn't agree with that, but I think we can both address why somebody wants to kill themselves, and I think we absolutely should. We should address the poverty that causes people that want to die. The demographic that dies most in the United States from guns is actually predominantly middle-aged to white men in rural and suburban areas, in areas like New Hampshire, like Vermont, a lot of the states that were mentioned earlier in this debate. And we have to address those deaths. And the reason why I say that is not only because it's the right thing to do, but because they are preventable. Not entirely, but largely preventable. Because we know that 90% of people who survive their first attempt do not reattempt. That is why we have to address the firearm in relation to the gun suicide rate in this country. And we also have to address the fact that mental illness has, people that are mentally ill, as a result of the statistics that were talked about earlier, are far more likely to harm themselves than somebody else. When I was in Maine a couple of years ago, I was talking to a bunch of high schoolers about voter registration and other stuff, and there was a girl that came up to me, she was a sophomore, and she said, I care a lot about addressing this mental health, but I'm really concerned because I told my school guidance counselor that I have anxiety, and I was put on a list of potential school shooters.
Yep.
That is not the world that I think Spike wants to create or either of us wants to create. But I think that we can both address how somebody gets a gun and why they want to kill themselves, and we should do both and not just one or the other.
Thanks. Due to time, that is our last question. Now we will be moving on to 2-minute closing remarks.
You want to go first, Spike?
No, I'm good. Let's get to the Q&A.
Closing remark?
That was my closing remark.
Okay. David,
I'll take my closing remark if I have extra time. Look, there's a lot of nuances that go into addressing gun violence in America, and I don't think Spike has the total solution. I frankly don't think I have the total answer to solving all this, because there's so many different ways that it happens. It's not just mass shootings, right? What happened in Parkland is obviously horrifying, but what happened in Parkland represents a tiny minority of what happens every day in this country, vast majority of which is gun suicides. But I still think we have to address those and not act like we can only address one or the other. And in this debate, what I've presented you all is talking about that personally, I believe that we need to address how somebody gets a firearm in the first place, and that I think if there is somebody that's threatening to shoot up a high school, I don't think that they should necessarily, be given a court date immediately and then have their firearm removed later on. That's an immediate and present threat to the community, and that person should have their firearms removed and be given due process after that. That's what I was getting at earlier. I don't think that's an affront to anybody's civil liberties. I think that helps protect all of us in the first place. I know there are some people that disagree with that, but that's my stance. So I think we need to address how somebody gets a gun and why they want to pick up a gun in the first place. Part of the challenge with this work is that Spike can talk all he wants about, individual instances of self-defense gun use. Because when that happens, it's on Fox News, it's on Breitbart, it's on every single damn news channel of the right. But the reality is, it's impossible to talk about the shooting that didn't happen, like the one that could have happened to my mother, where if that man continued to be armed, I may have had to bury her. And I don't think that that man necessarily I don't think that the law that we passed after Parkland is a violation of anybody's civil rights. I think it actually helps to protect our civil rights because mind you, we're in the state right now that's the live free or die state, right? Am I wrong about that? Yes. The ultimate violation on all of our liberties is death. And the current state of affairs that we have in America right now is one where we are far more likely than almost any other developed country to die from gun violence or gun suicide even than those other countries. And I think that doing the same common thing that we have been isn't going to solve that. And I agree in some respects with what you're saying of how we have to address why people pick up a gun, but I think we can't just do that. We need to address both.
Spike, still no desire for a closing remark?
I think the only thing I will say, since I'm taking back part of my 2 minutes, I want to be clear that when Nicholas Cruz was threatening to shoot up the school prior to the actual shooting or any instance like that, he should have been charged for that. That's actually a crime. That was what I meant when I said it's a failure of the justice system. When that threat was made against your mother or anything like that, those are crimes being committed. And yes, they can step in because of a crime being committed and say, you have committed the crime of threatening someone. And so not only are we taking your guns, we're taking your freedom by holding you and now putting you through due process, right? What a red flag law does is it says we're going to take your guns based on someone asserting that you've done something with little to no evidence. We're not going to let you know what happened until after the fact. You have no ability to prove your innocence. In fact, no one's trying to prove your innocence. We're not even looking at innocence. We just want to know if there was a claim so we can take your guns from you. That's why I'm against red flag laws. But no, absolutely. The person who made that threat, that was disgusting, and they should be not just lose their guns, but be punished for it. So I agree 100% on that. I want to make that clear. And other than that, no, I have nothing left to say, and let's get to Q&A.
Excellent. Well, now we will turn to audience Q&A. You can form two lines. We will alternate between the two lines of people with mics there at the front. So we can start on this side. No, what? This side? You want to start over here? Okay.
Hi. Thank you both so much for being here. I have a question for you, Spike. So David mentioned this early on in the debate about the importance of understanding basic principles of statistics. Mm-hmm. Looking at most of the studies you pointed to, you seem to argue that because certain locations with strict gun control legislation have high levels of gun violence and vice versa, like with DC versus Vermont, there is no correlation between gun control and gun deaths. However, we know that two variables can have causation without correlation because there are variables affecting the data set. How can you empirically prove there is not a causal relationship here?
I'm saying that there's no data that is implying that there is. I want to be clear, I'm not saying that guns inherently make us more safe because we have more guns than anywhere else on Earth, and if we did, there'd be no one close to as safe as we are because we have way more guns than anyone else. So no, I'm not making that claim. What I'm saying is we're not seeing any data that correlates, much less causates. So I hope that answered your question.
Outside of Wikipedia, of course.
Again, that was citing data from the UN and those countries that were saying what they were. Next time I'm going to bring a chart, and it's going to cite every single country's government that's listed on there.
Spike, like in my debate classes, like if I brought this up in a debate, I would be thrown out and fail immediately.
Let's move on to
the only reason I bring this up, just as one point, is because like you can edit Wikipedia. So just in the future, I'd appreciate those like direct sources.
I'm going to get your email address, and I'm going to send you that, but it's going to
we'll continue this conversation.
Let's move on. Next question, please.
Hi, this question is for David. First off, great debate. It's a lot better when one side isn't blasting Disney music while the other side is trying to speak. You might just raise the mic a little bit, leaning down. So the organization that you founded, March for Our Lives, one of the key policies that you guys advocate for is an assault weapon ban, which until tonight I feel like that you've never really defined, and tonight you did define it as a semi-automatic rifle. Many assault weapons banned nationwide encompass a whole lot more than that. You have pistols, you have long guns, you have various types of firearms, including .22 caliber firearms. Mm-hmm. You did mention that you are opposed to the police state. You think it's an ever-growing part of the government, and you're opposed to that. However, gun control always has to be enforced at the barrel of a gun. And part of the party platform of March for Our Lives is advocating for a mandatory gun buyback of so-called assault weapons, which would be gun confiscation. So my question to you is, if you are ever able to enact that policy and enforce it, will you be the first person in the stack to come take it from me, or are you going to have the same armed state agents that you hate so much do the dirty work for you?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's been, in the history of March for Our Lives, obviously we started out as a group of students after shooting, and we believe that it is important to address these high-powered rifles that have enabled the state to be militarized as an excuse in the first place. Because part of the reason why the state became so militarized as it is today is because of multiple, there was one instance, I forget the exact name of it, but there was an instance in the 90s, it was a pretty infamous armed robbery in Los Angeles where the assailants were heavily armed and outgunned the police, and that enabled the police to have the justification to arm themselves even more and continue taking a lot of the military surplus in the first place. So I think part of that conversation is about de-escalating the arms race that we're in, and I think a parallel to that is ensuring that state law enforcement agencies, if a policy like that ever was passed, which to be clear, with the current courts, I think you and I both know is not going to happen, even if we wanted it to, and also just logistically speaking, it would be very hard to implement and enforce. It's not people going to your door and saying, you have to give us your guns. I don't think that would even be possible, right, with the number of guns that we have in our society today. I think what we're advocating for is an arms race reduction between the state and the civilians, because right now the path that we're on is not a good one. Because when people talk all the time about the need for guns to fight over a tyrannical government, here's my question to you. How do you define a tyrannical government? Is it the one that we had on January 6th?
You want to go back and forth here?
No, I'm just stating, I'm stating that as a hypothetical.
I'll go back
Sorry.
and forth.
But that's part of the danger that comes because, when the founders were talking about, the need for civilians to be armed in the first place, there was a balancing act between stopping the tyranny of the people and the tyranny of the government at the same time. And I don't want either of those things. And I think right now...
The tyranny of the people was the British government, though.
Well, what do you mean?
What do you mean? That's why we had the Second Amendment in the first place.
What I'm talking about is specifically addressing the fact that we can't have mob rule in our society by force, right? We are a country of laws. And with that, that's my main answer to that.
Respectfully disagree.
Totally, I totally understand.
I don't want to.
I think we need to move on. Just
Okay, no, that's
because
fine.
we're
That's fine.
running out of time.
Yeah.
But
Hey, so my question is for both speakers, but I'll address it to you, Spike. But before that, I just want you to know, David, that if you want an edit to stick, yes, anybody can edit Wikipedia, but if you want it to stick, it's a bureaucratic nightmare. It's a slog. It's not easy.
Still not a good defense,
It's not easy.
but yeah.
But my question for both of you is, have you seriously thought of or considered, and can you elaborate and tell me and the rest of the audience if there is any evidence, and I'm only asking hypothetical, I'm not saying like, here it is, but is there any evidence that you've thought of if it was presented to you that it would change your mind? Not entirely, I'm not saying like 180, I mean slightly. Like for you, Spike, is there any evidence where if you were convinced to your satisfaction that carrying a gun would make you less safe and you would be more in danger for owning a gun or carrying a gun, would that change your mind a little bit?
If I thought that my owning and carrying a gun made me less safe, I wouldn't do it. Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. That wouldn't change my belief that other people have a right to make that choice for themselves. But if I made that choice, if I saw that evidence or came to believe that that were the case, then I absolutely wouldn't carry a firearm. And I guess the reverse of that question for David, yeah.
The question being, is there any evidence that you've thought of, not specific, I'm talking about hypothetical, that, but not unreasonable, that you could be shown or that you would come to believe is true to change your mind not 180 degrees from your position right now, but slightly, what would that look like? What would it be?
Well, I mean, it would be a massive amount of research from an independent third party like the CDC or NIH or somebody like that, which I know some people are not going to say is independent, but I personally can't think, like, I don't have control over the CDC, right? Like, I think part of the problem right now is the people that are gathering a lot of this data, they're funded by sources that are obviously conflicts of interest, whether it's the NRA or whether it's people with certain ideological, allegiances on the left or the right. And we need more empirical data to show what the actual impact is. And, unlike a lot of people that I have conversations with, at least the most extreme of them, I don't think Spike is one of them, to be honest with you, but the most extreme of them that I will say terrible things to me online, on Twitter, and they'll call me awful things. And I say, look, is there anything that I can say to you that would change your mind, any amount of statistics or stories or anything like that would change your mind? And they say no. It's like, well, then I'm not here to debate you. But in my case, like, I'm open to hear what I genuinely want. The reason I am here today is because I want the best solution possible for this, right? I don't think that that's necessarily going to come from me talking to the same people over and over again, even if we have strong disagreements at times. It's going to come from figuring out what we can agree on and moving forward on that, even as there are things that we may not agree on in the background. So yes, I'm open to hearing more information and looking at it, and if it's compelling, changing my position on it because I want the best solution here. I'm not here just to stick to bullshit like talking points or anything like that. I'm here because I want the best solution.
I'd like to openly lament the fact that this wasn't a 4-hour debate, which would have given David and I time to talk about, I think, a lot of things we probably do agree on when it comes to the war on drugs and the police state and a lot of things like that. Anyway, I don't want to take up any more.
Hi, my name is Lily Tang Williams, and welcome to my live free or die state. Actually, I am a Chinese immigrant who survived communism. And under Mao, 40 million people were starving to death after he sold communism to them, and 20 million people died, murdered during his Cultural Revolution. So my question to you, David, is that can you guarantee me, a gun owner tonight, our government in the US, in DC, will never become a tyrannical government? Can you guarantee that to me?
There's no way I can ever guarantee that any government will not be tyrannical.
Well, then the debate on gun control is over because I will never give up my guns. Never. And you should go to China to see how gun control works for dictatorship of CCP. Because, everybody enslaved, so they cannot fight back.
Can I respond to you?
Of course.
I am extremely sorry that you've gone through that and witnessed that. The collectivization of agriculture, for one, the Cultural Revolution are horrific things that never should have happened, ever. And I would do everything in my power to stop that from ever happening in the United States of America. I'm not advocating for you having your gun taken away. I'm genuinely not. I know it may be hard for you to believe that, but I'm not advocating for any law-abiding citizen to have that happen to them. What I believe is that the real danger that we have in America right now is all of these people that increasingly believe that elections are not real, that are denying the results of them, being heavily armed, and repeatedly saying that they need to overthrow a government because they've been fed lies and misinformation. That is really what I fear, becoming a tyrannical government. I also fear the fact that in some ways we've had multiple violations of our rights, not, excluding everything in this conversation, just going to the Fourth Amendment in the Patriot Act or the FISA Act, the Foreign Intelligence and Surveillance Acts. Those are severe violations of our civil rights and liberties that personally I view right now are a far greater threat to our freedom than red flag laws. And we need to address that because it's enabled the mass surveillance of the American people that is illegal and a disgusting violation of our civil rights and our civil liberties as well. I never want to have what happened in China happen in the United States, ever. And I am truly sorry that you ever had to witness that and go through that. And I don't want that to happen. But personally, what I believe is that having stronger laws like Massachusetts is not going to enable that government to come to power. What will enable it is things like the Patriot Act and FISA and other similar violations to our civil rights and liberties that need to be addressed. I don't think it's necessarily it's going to be gun control though, because we have 450 million guns in this country right now. And even if we had an incredibly powerful government. It is hard for me to imagine the same state that couldn't fix Afghanistan, that spent trillions of dollars there, that it could ever take 450 million guns. I don't know if you guys
This guy's
have been working.
taking my talking points. What, yeah.
It really couldn't though, right? Like we could talk about the theoreticals all day here of the danger of somebody doing that, but I think the practicality is these school shootings and gun violence continue happening, and we need to do as much as we can to prevent that. And I think part of the solution is addressing how a 19-year-old was able to own an AR-15 despite threatening to shoot up my high school multiple times.
But you trust government too much.
Sorry, we need to move
Yeah,
on
no,
to the
it's-
next
I appreciate your
question.
question though. Thank you.
Thank you. So no, I agree it's important to not deal with simply theoreticals, but actual data, and also to understand the sources we're working with. This is from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.org, and specifically just a point that I wanted to ask one of you about. You can decide who answers, but and I'll make this really quick. So on September 29th and the 30th, 1941, 33,771 Jews were massacred during a 2-day period, so less than 48 hours, in what's been termed the Baba Yar massacre outside Kiev, Ukraine. And the question is, how, we've talked about, I've heard a lot about mass shootings, and we have to consider how do we even define that, but in terms of these very large-scale shootings, how should that factor in any policy making in the overall discussion?
Do you want to do that first? Okay. First of all, I am Jewish, for whatever that's worth. But in order for the Nazi regime to carry out its crimes, there's actually something that many people, my friends on the right, will say when they'll say, first, Hitler disarmed everyone. That's actually not true. The Weimar Republic disarmed everyone. It was a liberal government that disarmed everyone for their safety. That allowed a right-wing authoritarian to come in and say, oh, everyone's disarmed? Oh, great, I can oppress whomever I want. I want to oppress the Jews and the Roma and homosexuals. But of course, as we know, we would never in America have a liberal government take our rights and then a right-wing authoritarian populist demagogue get back into power and use that against us. That would never happen here. But no, so to address what you said, I think that when you have a disarmed populace, or you have one section of a populace that has been disarmed, and another section that is armed, which we saw many times in this country, what ends up happening is inevitable. It's going to be the powerful majority that is still armed imposing themselves on the vulnerable minority. That, by the way, is why I believe that there's higher levels of crime and violent crime in inner cities to this day. Because we had a situation where for many, many years, black people basically weren't allowed to own guns in order to make sure that they couldn't defend themselves. And we see the continuation of the systemic problem that happened there lead into peaceful, law-abiding black people being less likely to own firearms, which means they're more likely to be victimized. Couple that with lower police response times and all the other things that come with that. And because a unfortunate additional effect to making a minority population vulnerable to the thugs that run the country is that you also make them vulnerable to the thugs that live in their community. And I think that if we were allowing people, peaceful and law-abiding people, to be armed, we'd see far fewer shootings and killings of any kind.
Well, I obviously don't agree with that. I think having more people in our society, the part that I don't agree with in particular is this idea that having more guns out there is just going to make us inevitably safer for the reasons that I stated earlier. I mean, I've seen so many customer service disputes where I know it would have been not unlikely that a shooting could have happened there if both individuals were armed, right? Like there's so many instances like this that we see all the time, whether it's road rage, whether it's bar fights, whether it's anything like that. And if you add guns into that situation, it's going to make it more lethal. And that's not even having a discussion of whether or not we should have guns in our society or not. That's not what this conversation is about, to be clear. It's not saying that nobody in our society by any means should have guns. That is not what I am saying, to be clear. What we're talking about here are theoreticals in the United States that are not even necessarily really germane to what I am saying at times. And And also, I'm talking about a certain level of regulation here that is common in most developed countries, where we've not seen anything as horrific as that happen. On the topic that was brought up earlier on the gun buybacks in particular, though, part of that was inspired by what they did in Australia after the Port Arthur massacre. They did a massive gun buyback in their country, and they've had basically, I think, 2 mass shootings in the 20 years since. And gun deaths did go down substantially, because it turns out when you address how many guns are in a country, you get a reduction in gun deaths. And I don't know about you all, but last I checked, Australia is not currently under a totalitarian regime.
We do need to move on to our final question due to time.
Thank you, and thank you to the Dartmouth Union for hosting this debate. My question is for the gentleman who was for red flag laws until he was against Trump and is now, I gather, for killing FISA. Maybe we should tell him that Trump opposes FISA as well. Whereas you cited our state motto, live free or die, in claiming that the ultimate harm is death. And whereas, in fact, our state motto, fully spoken, was a toast by General John Stark, live free or die, death is not the worst of evils. He said that precisely because a loss of our natural rights and our constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property was a fate far worse than death. And whereas you have asserted that we are in a representative democracy, we are indeed in a representative democracy in Congress supporting a constitutional republic of which the Constitution is unassailable. You have asserted several times, just in the last few minutes in the answers to the other questioners, that you don't believe in coming and taking all of our weapons. You asserted during the main part of the debate in response to one of the questions that you, in fact, are for people's right to self-defense. Would you tell us then, if you consider it important that we can defend ourselves, then who exactly is going to be allowed to defend themselves and who is not? Are you going to be limiting this and limiting their gun ownership by age, by race, by creed, by illegality, by patriotism? What is it that you are intending to do other than to take people's guns away?
Look, I feel like there's a lot of tension in the room right now. I don't know about you all. What I'm advocating for, I'm not going to claim to be Spike said earlier he's not an expert on this. Like, I obviously came into this because of something horrific that happened to me when I was 17 years old. And I've been compelled to act on what I believe on, which is that, like I've said repeatedly throughout this debate, all I would want is for the United States federal government to have the same laws in all 50 states as Massachusetts has. And I know that you guys don't agree with that. That is fine. I can respect that you don't agree with that, sir. I totally can.
Do you know what the gun laws are?
Hey, please, come on.
I can totally respect that you don't agree with that. And I would hope that we can have a respectful conversation about this, of course. And I thank you for your question. The point that I'm getting at is that's just what I want, right? And there, of course, you obviously do not agree with that, and that is okay. And I think that for me to have a longer conversation with you about that, about what the different viewpoints are and everything, is something that could happen, but it's not one where we're going to be able to spend the next 2 hours debating the nuances of American constitutional history, gun violence prevention laws, and other things like that. What I would like to kind of, because I think this is probably the last question, what I would like to end on is like, look, I'm not, I feel like there's this sense that has been created since Parkland that I'm some kind of totalitarian that wants to take everybody's, like, I'm just a guy. I'm just a guy that doesn't want what happened in Parkland to happen again. Do I have all the answers to that? No, I'm not going to act like I do. Have I been wrong in the past? I definitely have. I'm sure Spike will admit that he's been wrong in the past on different things.
On occasion,
At
yes.
times, right?
Yeah, at times, but
And what I'm getting at is that I think that the current course that we've been on throughout American history of just having the same answer where we put more guns into this situation, I don't agree that that's necessarily the right answer. Now, I don't think that that means that there shouldn't be any guns in our society, nor do I think that would be logistically, constitutionally, or practically possible, even if I was advocating for that. But what I am saying is I think it's time for us to do something different. God forbid. Because I think the current reality that we face right now, the reality, not the hypothetical, but the reality of gun violence in America being at such a high rate is something that can't just be addressed by addressing the systemic problems that drive it. We also need to address the fact that somebody like the shooter at my high school is still able in many states to get a gun like the AR-15 despite threatening to shoot up a high school. That's all I'm advocating for. And for those that don't agree with me, I want to say this to you because I feel like a lot of these questions were more pointed at me. I respect you. I respect your concerns. They are valid in many ways. You have a right to express them, and I respect that. I want to have that conversation with you. But what I would urge us to understand is that further arguing about this, instead of what I wish we could have done more of in this debate, was talk about what we can agree on, right? And focus on those things, because I think there are things that we can do. But what I would urge, if I can, I guess in my last word, and Spike, you can obviously have your closing remark too after this, is for us to have some more nuance around this conversation and understanding that it's not easy for me to be up here having this conversation, obviously, after what I've gone through. The threats that my family's faced, that I've faced, and the trauma that comes with that. But I do know if I'm genuinely committed to addressing this issue that we need to have conversations about what we can agree on, even if we very strongly don't agree on some things. We should focus on the fact that most of us agree that we need more mental health funding for the 2/3 of gun deaths that are suicides. Right, Spike?
We absolutely need to address suicide, 100%.
Right. We do agree on the fact that, at least I would say probably most of us agree that we need more information on what gun laws that are out there do work. Maybe all of us don't agree in this room on that, but I would say a lot of people do in the first place. And we also need to address the hatred that causes so many people to pick up a gun in the first place. We need to address the systemic racism and poverty that causes people to pick up a gun in the first place. And if there are people in this room that want to work with me just on that, I'm willing to have that conversation with you, and I want to. Because what I don't want to do is I don't want to leave this damn room and have us all leave with the same opinions that nothing can be done about this issue as people are dying every day. Because that's who loses this debate. It's those people. And people who walk out of here who say that there is nothing that can be done about this issue because we're just too divided. There's never been an instance in our country's history where we just accepted something like that, especially an issue as important as that, and I refuse to accept that that is the country that we live in, and I hope that you all would as well. And I appreciate you listening to me. And I also appreciate Spike being here and, coming with your sources and everything, which I wish that I had to with you.
I'm sorry.
I've never done one of these before, so. But thank you for being here.
I'm happy to be
Thank
here.
you for having this conversation, and thank you to those of you who don't agree with me for being here and listening. I respect you, and I want to figure out what we can get done on this issue because it's not a left or right thing. I don't think any of us wants gun violence to continue. We just have different ways of figuring out how to address it, but there is some alignment.
Yeah, I was not joking when I lamented that this wasn't a longer discussion where David and I could focus not just on the debate questions at hand, but on the things that I think there are probably quite a few things that we agree on there. And that actually, in finding out what we agree on, might be able to help us address some of the things we disagree on. This is unfortunately the nature of these types of debates, but I'm glad that you came. It means a lot to me that you came. I also clearly, and I don't think anyone in here wants another Parkland or another Uvalde or another any of these. And I'm glad neither of us got into the bad faith tactic of accusing the other of wanting some terrible thing to happen, because clearly we don't. We just disagree on how we get there. And I just want to thank the folks at Dartmouth Political Union for being a part of this, for putting this together, for being this. Grayling, I know that you were cool as a cucumber through all of this. I think you did a great job. David, I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate your viewpoints on this, and I appreciate everyone that took part in this. Thank you, guys. Thank you for doing this. Appreciate y'all.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We really love hosting expert and student debates like this because we want audiences to understand and our debaters as well to understand that really, as a society, we only learn from each other through dialogue. Dialogue across difference allows us to develop our own ideas, see the nuances and complexities in another's argument. And so thank you for being part of that very democratic experiment with us today. We really appreciate it. With that being said, thank you once again to our speakers, to the Dartmouth Political Union, to the incredible Dartmouth staff that we have here who have made this event possible. I'm going to put up our post-survey to see how audience members' views might have changed. You will have noticed that we had several more respondents than we had in the room, so I think we've had some online viewers with us who are participating. I think for this post-survey, we would just prefer if those who are currently in the room fill it out, just so we can get a sense of those who were here with us and attended the debate, how their opinions might have shifted, though we know that we can't control that completely, and we'll see what the data has to say. So I'll give you a second to fill out the post-survey.
Wow, the future is so weird.
My wife's technically not a citizen. Can she vote? Is that not the thing?
Those in the room. We need some Jeopardy music while
I was going to
people
say,
fill out
we
the
need
survey.
some kind of like, the Dartmouth DPU needs to have
Exactly.
someone make a...
All right. Has everybody voted, or are people still voting? You can let me know by raising. Okay. You voted? Okay. Let me try to.
Is anyone who agrees with me still voting? Okay, all right, we need more time.
Is it working now? Yeah. Try reloading it. It should work.
My phone died.
Yeah, I took the pre-test, but then it died, so I can't.
All right. I'm going to read out the results. So we have. Oh, okay. We'll wait.
I'd like to preemptively say that this vote was rigged. I was way ahead, and then something happened.
All right, all good? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for participating in this. So we have 40 responses. For the first question, we asked, does gun ownership increase or decrease safety? We had 54.1% say, oh, actually, that just changed. We have 41 responses now. For the question of does gun ownership increase or decrease safety, 52.6% believe that it decreases safety, and 47.4% believe it increases safety. To the question of do you favor stricter gun laws, 70.7% favor stricter gun laws, and 29.2% do not favor stricter gun laws.
I had nothing to do with that. I didn't vote. No, I didn't. You can check. I was worried that Spike's watch parties were going to do some electric interference.
But I think what this shows is that there's a variety of perspectives on this issue, both pre and post-survey. So thank you once again for joining us, and we hope you join us at our next event.